The builders were simply carrying out a routine demolition of an old movie theater when one broken wall revealed a secret that had been hidden for decades. What the foreman found shocked everyone and sent waves across the entire country. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. The Liberty Crown Theater had stood in the heart of Maple Creek for so long that no one could remember a time when its brick facade had not been part of the town's daily horizon. Built in the early 1930s, when optimism was still something people could afford, it had once been the brightest place for miles around. Its marquee, now rusted and dark, used to glow like a promise in the evenings, letters rearranged by teenage ushers who dreamed of becoming actors or musicians. On Saturday mornings, children had lined up for cartoons and cheap candy, while on winter nights couples had escaped the cold inside its velvet-lined halls, pretending that the world on the screen was somehow their own. By the time Marcus Hall first walked through its doors as the demolition foreman, the Liberty Crown was no longer a theater in any meaningful sense. The carpet was threadbare and smelled faintly of mold. Pigeons nested in the rafters, and water stains crept like bruises across the ceiling. The once grand chandelier in the lobby hung crooked, half of its bulbs long dead. Old posters still clung to the walls behind cracked glass, advertising films that had left the cultural memory decades ago. The building felt less like a ruin and more like a body abandoned too long, preserved only by neglect. Maple Creek had been shrinking for years. Factories that had once employed entire neighborhoods had closed, leaving behind empty parking lots and fading logos on red brick warehouses. Downtown storefronts were boarded up or rented out to pawn shops and payday lenders. When the city council finally approved the Liberty Crown's demolition, many residents shrugged in tired resignation. They had heard the promises before. New development would bring life back to the center, they were told, would attract tourists and money, would fix what had been broken by time and bad decisions. It was always the same story, always delivered by men in suits who did not live in the neighborhoods they planned to erase. Marcus had heard those stories all his life. He was 42, tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet authority that came from decades on construction sites. He had started as a teenager carrying scrap lumber for cash, learned how to pour concrete, how to frame walls, how to keep a crew working when heat or exhaustion threatened to slow everything down. His hands were thick with calluses, his back already beginning to ache in the mornings in a way that no amount of stretching could undo. To him, the Liberty Crown was supposed to be just another job. One more building to dismantle carefully, one more deadline to meet. But he had grown up only 6 blocks from the theater, in a row of narrow houses that had vanished in the so-called urban renewal of the late 1960s. His mother had never stopped talking about the day the city posted eviction notices on their doors, promising compensation that never quite covered the cost of starting over. The neighborhood had been labeled blighted, which was a polite way of saying that no one with real influence wanted to see the people who lived there anymore. Marcus had been too young to understand the politics, but old enough to remember the sound of bulldozers tearing into the houses where his friends had lived. The memory still surfaced whenever he saw demolition equipment idle in the early morning light, like predators waiting for a signal. The Liberty Crown contract was different from the start. It had come through a large development firm based out of state, a corporation with deep pockets and an impressive portfolio of luxury complexes and commercial centers. Their representative had been unusually insistent about speed, about privacy, about controlling access to the site. No photographs were to be taken without written permission. Certain areas of the building were marked on the blueprints as technical spaces not requiring inspection. Marcus had frowned when he noticed that the plans for the stage area were incomplete, that entire sections were shaded out with vague annotations about structural hazards. He had questioned the omission, of course. It was part of his job to know where the load-bearing walls were, where hidden wiring or gas lines might still lurk. The answer he received was polite but evasive, delivered by a project manager who spoke of liability and proprietary information as though those words were shields against further inquiry. Marcus had accepted the explanation outwardly. Inside, a quiet unease had begun to form, the kind he usually ignored because it so often turned out to be nothing. Preparation for the demolition took weeks. Crews stripped out seats from the auditorium, their metal frames screeching in protest as bolts were loosened for the first time in decades. Old concession counters were dismantled, revealing layers of outdated wiring and forgotten plumbing. Sometimes they found small relics tucked into corners, a child's sneaker, a yellowed program, coins that had slipped through the cracks in the floorboards. It felt like disassembling a collective memory piece by piece, and the men joked to keep the mood light, even as dust settled in their lungs and on their clothes. Yet, the building resisted in subtle ways. Marcus noticed walls that did not align with the original architectural drawings he had dug up from the county archive. He noticed metal doors sealed behind layers of drywall, their handles removed as though someone had not wanted them opened again. He noticed, too, that the sound changed in certain corridors, becoming strangely muted, as if the walls themselves were swallowing it. One night, the site alarm went off, a piercing electronic shriek that sent Marcus out of bed and into his truck long after midnight. By the time he arrived, the private security guards contracted by the developer were already on site, pacing with flashlights and radios. They told him it had been a false trigger, probably a bird or a faulty sensor. Marcus walked the perimeter anyway, boots crunching on gravel, his eyes scanning the dark facade of the Liberty Crown. He could not explain why he expected to see a light on inside, or a shadow moving where no one should be. The next morning, he found a handwritten note on his clipboard instructing his crew to begin demolition behind the stage, even though that area had been scheduled for later in the project. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp, and hurried. When he called the project manager, he was told that priorities had shifted, that the back rooms needed to be cleared immediately for structural assessment. There was no further explanation. Standing on the stage, surrounded by peeling curtains and warped wooden panels, Marcus felt the weight of the place settle over him. He imagined the thousands of performances, speeches, and screenings that had happened there, the echoes of applause that still seemed to cling to the dust. He gave the order to proceed because that was what he had been hired to do. The crew brought in the hydraulic hammer, positioning it carefully against a wall that, according to the incomplete plans, concealed nothing more than storage space. The first impact rang through the building like a bell. Plaster shattered, drifting down in pale clouds. The second impact drove deeper, revealing bricks that were darker and denser than the surrounding masonry. When the hammer struck a third time, the sound changed abruptly. It was no longer the dull crack of brick giving way, but a hollow thud that reverberated through the stage floor and into Marcus's chest. He raised his hand, and the machine went silent. Dust hung in the air, shimmering in the shafts of light that slipped through holes in the roof. Marcus stepped forward, heart beating faster than he could justify, and peered into the fractured wall. Where there should have been more brick and wood, there was only darkness. He leaned closer and tapped the opening with the butt of his flashlight. The echo came back to him instantly, proof of empty space where the blueprints had promised none. For a long moment, he said nothing, listening to the settling creaks of the old building and to the low murmur of his crew behind him. He knew then that whatever lay hidden beyond that wall was not meant to be found, and that the job he had accepted was about to become something far more complicated than a routine demolition. With a deep breath, he told the crew to widen the opening, slowly and carefully. The hammer resumed its work, biting into the wall with renewed purpose, and as the opening grew, the darkness beyond it seemed to deepen, like a wound finally being exposed after decades of being sealed away. The opening behind the stage widened slowly, every strike of the hydraulic hammer tearing away another piece of the Liberty Crown's carefully preserved lie. The dust was so thick that Marcus could taste it, chalky and bitter on his tongue, a flavor that seemed to belong to the building itself rather than to the debris now scattered across the warped boards of the stage. The crew worked with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their usual banter subdued as the hole grew large enough for a man to step through. When the wall finally gave up its last resistance, the space beyond revealed itself not as a forgotten storage closet or a neglected crawl space, but as something altogether different. Marcus was the first to cross the threshold, ducking under jagged bricks and brushing plaster from his jacket. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed on concrete so smooth and unblemished that it looked as if it had been poured yesterday rather than half a century ago. The room was soundproofed. He realized it almost immediately, not through any visible label or sign, but through the way his own breathing seemed to fall dead a few feet from his mouth. The thick walls swallowed every echo, leaving behind a heavy silence that pressed against his ears. There were no windows. The air felt stale, carrying a faint metallic odor that reminded him of old electrical rooms and forgotten basements. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to isolate this place from the rest of the building. As more of the crew gathered behind him, Marcus swept his light across the walls. He saw remnants of foam padding still clinging to the concrete in places, blackened with age. There were narrow channels carved into the floor where cables must once have run, converging toward a corner where a rusted junction box protruded like a broken tooth. Whatever this room had been used for, it had not been part of any ordinary theater operation. He knelt to inspect one of the channels more closely and noticed that it did not simply end at the wall. It disappeared beneath a rectangular concrete slab, one that looked out of place in an otherwise uniform floor. A second slab lay nearby, then a third, all flush with the surrounding surface but separated by seams so fine they would have escaped a casual glance. The men behind him had begun whispering now, their voices instinctively lowered as though they were standing in a church. Marcus stood and walked toward the slabs, his boots scuffing softly against the dust. He pressed the edge of his flashlight against the seam of the nearest one and pried. The slab shifted with a reluctant scrape, revealing a narrow cavity beneath. The smell hit him first, not the sharp stench of decay, but something drier and older, like the inside of a long-sealed trunk. He angled the light into the opening and saw the outline of a body curled unnaturally against the concrete walls of the cavity. Bones gleamed pale where fabric had rotted away, ribs pressed tight together as if the person had been folded into the space. The skull was tilted toward the corner, jaw agape in a silent question that had gone unanswered for decades. For a moment, Marcus could not speak. He had seen injuries before, accidents on construction sites that ended lives in a blink, but this was different. This was deliberate. This was someone hidden, erased not by time but by intention. He forced himself to breathe and told the crew to back away. One of the younger men retched and stumbled toward the door they had just opened, his face drained of color. Marcus pulled out his phone and called the police, his voice sounding oddly distant in his own ears as he reported what they had found. The authorities arrived quickly, their sirens slicing through the quiet streets of Maple Creek. They cordoned off the side, ushering the crew out and replacing their stunned presence with the methodical movements of forensic technicians. Marcus stood at the edge of the taped perimeter and watched as they photographed the room, measured the cavities, and carefully lifted the slab that had concealed the first body. That was when they discovered the others. One cavity led to another, each one containing remains arranged with the same grim precision. Some bodies were wrapped in what might once have been blankets or heavy coats, the fabric reduced to dark shreds. Others lay bare against the concrete, their bones cleanly articulated as if they had been placed there by someone who knew anatomy. There were no personal effects in the cavities, no wallets or jewelry, only the bodies themselves, stripped of identity and stored like objects. Along the far wall, half hidden behind a row of metal shelving units bolted to the concrete, the technicians found stacks of cardboard boxes. The labels on them were faded but still legible, handwritten in careful block letters that marked dates and times rather than names. Inside were reels of film, magnetic tapes, notebooks sealed in plastic sleeves. There were also 2 cameras, heavy 16mm models that looked more at home in a museum than in the ruins of a provincial theater. In a corner stood a small safe, its door locked but its hinges eaten away by rust. A technician made a note to have it opened later, away from the site. Marcus saw the way the lead detective's expression changed as he took in the scope of the discovery, the shift from procedural detachment to something darker and more urgent. By midday, the story had leaked. It always did. Someone posted a grainy photo to social media of police cars outside the Liberty Crown, and speculation exploded across the town. People who had not set foot in the theater for 20 years suddenly remembered it fondly, sharing stories and rumors with equal conviction. Local reporters gathered behind the barricades, microphones thrust toward anyone who looked like they might talk. Marcus did not. He answered the detective's questions because he had to, but he kept his eyes on the building whenever he could, trying to reconcile the quiet ruin he had walked through only hours before with the nightmare now unfolding behind its walls. Late in the afternoon, a representative from the Development Corporation arrived, flanked by 2 lawyers. They did not bother with condolences or expressions of shock. They asked how long the investigation would take, whether the site could be partially reopened, whether there was any legal basis for halting the entire project. Marcus watched the lead detective's jaw tighten as he explained, in increasingly clipped terms, that no one was going back into the building until the scene had been fully processed. It was during this exchange that Marcus noticed something else. One of the boxes that had been visible on the shelving units when he first entered the room was no longer there. He mentioned it to a technician who checked the inventory list and frowned. They had not removed it, and it was not among the items cataloged for transport. The technician brought it to the detective's attention, and for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its breath. They searched the shelves again, then the surrounding floor, then the doorway that led back to the stage. The box did not reappear. No one said what they were all thinking, but the implication was clear. Someone had taken it, either in the confusion of the discovery or before the police had fully secured the site. Someone who had known exactly what to look for and when to move. As night fell, Floodlights were set up around the Liberty Crown, bathing its facade in a harsh white glare that stripped away whatever dignity it had left. Marcus lingered longer than he should have, reluctant to leave the place that had so suddenly become the center of a storm. He stood in the empty street and looked up at the marquee, its metal letters bent and corroded, and wondered how many people had passed beneath it over the years without ever suspecting what lay hidden just a few feet away. When he finally drove home, the image of that first body stayed with him, as vivid as if it were still illuminated by his flashlight. He could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the room behind the stage was not a tomb but a doorway, and that whatever had been stored there had been waiting for the right moment to be found. The days that followed the discovery in the Liberty Crown Theater unfolded with the strange mixture of urgency and stagnation that only a large investigation could produce. The building itself remained sealed behind yellow tape and portable fencing, guarded around the clock by officers who had little to do beyond staring at a structure that had suddenly become more dangerous than any collapsing wall. Inside, however, the past was being dismantled with surgical care. The remains taken from beneath the concrete slabs were transported to the county morgue, where forensic teams began the slow work of identification. At first, the process seemed almost hopeless. The bodies were too old for fingerprints, the clothing too degraded for easy recognition. Yet the human frame keeps its own records, even when everything else has been erased. Dental charts were matched to archived records that had not been consulted in decades. A titanium plate found in one skull corresponded to a surgical operation recorded in a hospital ledger from 1974. A distinctive bone deformity matched a missing person's medical history. One by one, the names emerged from the silence. They were not random. They belonged to people whose disappearances had once stirred the town before being quietly folded into the background noise of history. A freelance journalist who had been investigating city contracts. A union organizer who had vanished after leading a strike at a now-defunct manufacturing plant. A young attorney who had represented families fighting eviction orders. A community activist whose name still appeared in half-forgotten articles about protests that had ended badly. The years beside their names clustered in the mid to late 1970s, the same period Maple Creek liked to remember as the dawn of its modern prosperity. Marcus read the preliminary report late one evening at his kitchen table, the pages illuminated by a single lamp. His hands trembled slightly as he turned them, not with fear so much as with the effort of absorbing a truth that no one in town had ever dared to articulate. These were not isolated tragedies. They were pieces of a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight, as carefully curated as the room beneath the Liberty Crown stage. While the forensic work continued, another team began cataloging the contents of the boxes recovered from the room. The reels of film were sent to a specialized lab for restoration. Many were damaged by moisture and age, but enough of the material survived to provide a fragmented yet coherent picture of what had once been recorded. The first images were mundane, grainy shots of city council chambers and hotel ballrooms, officials shaking hands beneath banners proclaiming civic pride. Then the camera angles changed. The footage moved closer, more intimate, catching faces in moments when they did not know they were being watched. The voices captured on the magnetic tapes were harder to ignore. The quality was poor, the sound distorted by time, but the content was unmistakable. Men discussed zoning changes as though they were military maneuvers. They spoke of relocating families in terms usually reserved for furniture. They joked about judges who owed them favors and police chiefs who understood when to look the other way. It was a ledger of power spoken aloud, unguarded, never meant to leave the walls of the hidden room. The most difficult material came last. On several reels, the camera no longer observed from a distance. It stood inside the room, facing a simple table lit by a single lamp. The people who sat there did not smile or posture. Their eyes darted nervously toward the unseen operator, their bodies hunched in ways that suggested fatigue or fear. On one tape, a man whose name Marcus now recognized as that of the missing union organizer pressed his palms flat against the tabletop, as though trying to anchor himself to reality. The sound cut in and out, but the tone of the voices around him left no room for misunderstanding. Those who had been found beneath the slabs had not merely been silenced. They had been interrogated, broken down piece by piece, their resistance documented before being extinguished entirely. The Liberty Crown had not been a theater for decades. It had been a machine. As word of the content spread beyond the local police department, the atmosphere in Maple Creek shifted. The initial shock of the discovery gave way to a kind of collective vertigo. The city council hastily convened closed sessions. The mayor released statements promising transparency while refusing to answer questions about why certain records from the 1970s were missing from the municipal archive. The development corporation that owned the theater site suspended all public communication, its website suddenly stripped of any reference to the Liberty Crown project. Marcus felt the pressure building around him, subtle at first. Reporters left business cards on his windshield. Old acquaintances he had not spoken to in years called him with clumsy expressions of concern that felt more like reconnaissance than sympathy. He declined every interview, aware that anything he said could be twisted into a narrative he did not control. One afternoon, he was asked to come down to the police station to review additional material. He walked past the rows of desks and into a small conference room where a projector had been set up. A detective he had come to recognize as the unofficial liaison to the families of the missing nodded to him and started the playback without ceremony. The footage that filled the wall was dated only by the clothing and hairstyles of the men it depicted. They were seated around a long table in a private dining room, their jackets draped over the backs of their chairs, glasses raised in a casual toast. The detective paused the image and pointed to one of the faces, then another. Marcus did not need the captions that followed. These were names he had grown up hearing, men who had been celebrated as the architects of Maple Creek's revival. A former mayor, a bank president whose portrait still hung in the courthouse lobby, the head of the police department as he had been in 1978, his hair darker then but his eyes unchanged. The detective resumed the footage. The men leaned in toward one another, voices lowered. They spoke of neighborhoods as though they were obstacles to be removed. They discussed the need to make examples of certain troublemakers, not in the abstract, but with references to specific individuals whose names now lay in the morgue. The camera lingered on their faces, capturing moments of irritation, of amusement, of calculation. It was as if the room itself had been a confessional, a place where power could speak honestly because it believed itself unseen. When the lights came back on, Marcus sat in silence for a long moment. The detective cleared his throat and handed him a still frame from another reel. It showed a man standing just inside the doorway of the hidden room, his profile partially obscured by shadow. The resolution was poor, but something about the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself, sent a chill through Marcus. He took the image home and laid it beside an old photograph he found in his mother's album. The resemblance was not perfect, but it was enough to unsettle him. The man in the still had the same slight tilt to his head, the same heavy brow that Marcus saw every time he looked in the mirror. The photograph in the album was of his grandfather, taken in the early 1970s, smiling awkwardly at a family picnic that had happened only months before he disappeared. The realization crept up on him slowly, like a rising tide. His grandfather had not simply vanished into obscurity. He had been close enough to the Liberty Crown to leave his imprint on its hidden machinery. Whether he had been a willing participant or a reluctant witness, Marcus could not yet say, but the implication was unavoidable. The erasure that had claimed so many lives had reached into his own family, and the room behind the stage had been the conduit through which it all had flowed. That night, he slept badly, haunted by the faces from the past that now refused to remain there. The Liberty Crown was no longer just a crime scene. It had become a mirror held up to the history of Maple Creek and to the life Marcus had inherited without ever knowing the cost. The still image from the projection room would not leave Marcus's mind. It followed him through the next days like a ghost that refused to fade, hovering at the edges of his vision whenever he closed his eyes. He tried to convince himself that the resemblance was coincidence, that the human brain was too eager to impose patterns on chaos, especially when grief and shock were involved. Yet the more he told himself this, the more the truth pressed against him from the inside. On a gray Saturday morning, he drove across town to his mother's house, a modest one-story place at the edge of a neighborhood that had survived every wave of redevelopment simply because no one had yet found a way to profit from it. She had lived there alone since his father's death, filling the rooms with a careful order that left no space for surprises. When she opened the door, her smile faltered at the sight of his face, drawn and sleepless. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. They sat at the kitchen table where he had once done his homework, and Marcus watched her hands as she folded and unfolded a napkin, a habit she had whenever she sensed bad news coming. He did not tell her immediately why he had come. Instead, he asked about his grandfather, about the years when she was young and Maple Creek still seemed like a place with a future. She spoke hesitantly at first, as though trying to recall a story she had not told in a long time. His grandfather had worked odd jobs after leaving the factory, she said, always restless, always looking for something better. For a while he had been employed at the Liberty Crown, tending the boilers, keeping the place running when the owners could not afford a full maintenance crew. Then, one winter, he had not come home. The police had taken a report, filed some papers, and moved on. The family had been told that he probably left town, that men did that sometimes when they felt trapped. Marcus listened in silence. He had heard this version of the story before, had grown up with it like an inherited bruise, but something in the way his mother spoke now made him realize how incomplete it had always been. There were details she avoided, moments where her voice trailed off, and she stared at the table as though seeing something written there that he could not. He asked about the eviction, about the house they had lost when the city decided to widen the road and sell the land to a developer whose name had since vanished from public memory. His mother shrugged in the same way she always had, saying that it had been a hard time, that people like them had no leverage when decisions were made far above their heads. Then she stopped herself, her eyes narrowing with a sudden intensity. There had been a man, she admitted, one who had come by shortly before his grandfather disappeared. He had not given his name, only said that he worked with the city and needed to ask a few questions about the theater. He had been polite, almost apologetic, but there was something in his manner that had made her uneasy. After that visit, the eviction notice had arrived faster than anyone expected. The pieces began to fit together with a quiet inevitability. Marcus felt as though he were standing at the edge of a map he had never been allowed to see, the familiar streets of his childhood suddenly revealing a pattern of lines and arrows pointing toward a destination he had avoided his entire life. On the drive back to his apartment, he detoured past the old site of his family's first home, now a vacant lot where weeds grew taller than a man's waist. He parked and got out, letting the wind cut through his jacket. The building had been gone for decades, but he could still trace the outline of the front steps in his mind, could still see his grandfather sitting there on summer evenings, a cigarette between his fingers, staring down the block as though waiting for something that never arrived. The pressure on Marcus intensified after that. It did not announce itself with threats or demands. Instead, it crept in through bureaucratic channels, through letters from the city inspector questioning minor code violations on sites he managed, through delays in permit renewals that had never been an issue before. His supervisor at the construction firm began to hint that perhaps it would be best if Marcus took some time off, let the situation cool down. The implication was clear enough. He was becoming inconvenient. One evening, he returned to his truck to find a plain envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper. There was no name on it, only his address written in block letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a printout of his mother's front porch, taken from across the street. The image was grainy, but unmistakable, the angle suggesting a camera hidden inside a parked car. There was no message attached. None was necessary. He drove straight to his mother's house and insisted that she pack a bag. He did not explain everything, only told her that it would be safer for her to stay with his sister in another town for a while. She protested weakly, unused to seeing him so shaken, but complied when he began to gather her things himself. As he loaded the car, he felt the weight of every choice he had made pressing down on him, the realization that his determination to uncover the truth was no longer his alone to bear. In the days that followed, Marcus limited his movements, alternating between his apartment and the police station where the investigation was now headquartered. He spoke at length with the detective who had shown him the footage, revealing what he had learned about his grandfather. The detective listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, and then admitted that the department had found no official record of Marcus's grandfather ever working at the Liberty Crown. The absence was itself a kind of evidence. It was at this point that the offers began to arrive. A representative from the Development Corporation requested a private meeting, suggesting that Marcus's experience and discretion made him a valuable asset. There was talk of a position at another site in a different state, a significant raise, the chance to put the unpleasantness of Maple Creek behind him. Marcus declined, his voice steady despite the anger that burned beneath the surface. The response was swift. The following week he was notified that his certification as a demolition supervisor would be subject to review due to unspecified safety concerns. The message was polite, bureaucratic, and devastating in its implications. Without that license, he would not only lose his job, but the profession he had built his life around. Yet, even as the walls closed in, Marcus felt something else taking root inside him. It was not courage exactly, but a stubborn clarity. For years he had believed that survival meant keeping his head down, working harder than everyone else, and never asking questions that might put him at odds with people who had more power than he did. Now he understood that this approach had cost him more than he had ever realized. It had cost him his grandfather. It had cost his family their home. It had cost his city its conscience. The still image from the hidden room remained on his kitchen table, its edges curling slightly from the humidity in his apartment. Marcus looked at it every morning before he left, a reminder that whatever role his grandfather had played in the machinery of the Liberty Crown, he had not been erased completely. His presence had left a mark, faint but undeniable. That mark had led Marcus back to the very place where the town had tried to bury its sins. As the investigation deepened and the first subpoenas were issued, Marcus began to understand that his story was no longer just about a room beneath a theater or a handful of bodies hidden under concrete. It was about a lineage of silence that stretched across generations, a pattern of loss that had shaped his own life in ways he was only now beginning to see. And he knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones, that turning back was no longer an option. The weeks after Marcus sent his mother away blurred into a continuous stretch of tension that never quite released its grip. Maple Creek was no longer merely the place where he lived and worked. It had become a battlefield whose front lines shifted invisibly from day to day. The investigation into the Liberty Crown spread outward in widening circles, yet every circle seemed to intersect with another web of influence that had not only survived the collapse of the old order, but had learned how to disguise itself as progress. The files that federal investigators began to compile were astonishing in their scope. Financial records revealed that companies listed on the reels from the 1970s had not disappeared as the public believed. They had been renamed, merged, folded into larger corporations with sleek branding and charitable foundations. The bank, whose former president had toasted the destruction of neighborhoods, now financed redevelopment projects across 3 states. The private security firm that appeared in the background of several interrogation tapes had rebranded itself as a consultancy specializing in urban safety, its executives sitting on advisory boards and speaking at conferences about community resilience. Marcus watched as the map of influence took shape on a wall in the task force office, lines connecting names to properties, properties to shell companies to campaign donations. It was no longer possible to dismiss the Liberty Crown as an isolated aberration. It was one node in a system that had learned how to launder its crimes through decades of respectability. As the scope widened, so did the resistance. Requests for documents were delayed or returned incomplete. Witnesses who had initially expressed willingness to testify suddenly remembered nothing, or declined interviews on the advice of newly acquired legal counsel. In one particularly troubling instance, a retired city clerk who had agreed to hand over copies of zoning records from the 1970s was found dead in his home 2 days later, the official cause listed as heart failure. The timing was impossible to ignore. Marcus felt the pressure tightening around him in ways that were both overt and insidious. His certification review was no longer merely a threat but a scheduled hearing, complete with a list of alleged infractions that ranged from minor safety oversights to fabricated claims of unreported incidents. The language was precise, clinical, designed to strip him of his livelihood without ever acknowledging the real reason. Then there were the calls. They came at odd hours, numbers blocked or routed through disconnected lines. Sometimes the caller said nothing, allowing only the sound of breathing to leak through the receiver before the line went dead. Other times, a recorded voice delivered a bland reminder about property taxes or vehicle warranties, its artificial cheerfulness a thin veil over something far more deliberate. Marcus learned to let the phone ring, yet he could not silence the unease that followed him from room to room like a shadow. One afternoon, while leaving the police station, he noticed a sedan idling across the street, its engine running despite the mild weather. The driver did not look at him directly, but Marcus recognized the posture of someone who was not there by accident. He drove away slowly, taking a circuitous route home and making 3 unnecessary turns, each one confirming that the car remained a fixed point behind him. It vanished only when he pulled into a busy supermarket parking lot, swallowed by a stream of other vehicles. Despite the fear, the investigation continued to break through in small but decisive ways. A reporter from a national outlet published a story that connected the Liberty Crown to similar facilities in other cities, each one a building that had undergone suspicious renovations during the same decade. The article quoted unnamed sources who described a coordinated effort to suppress dissent during the periods of aggressive urban redevelopment, using off-the-books detention sites to intimidate or eliminate those who resisted. Within hours of its publication, the piece was picked up by networks that had never mentioned Maple Creek before. The effect was electric. Calls poured into the task force from people across the country who claimed to recognize names or locations from the footage. A former city planner in Illinois sent scanned copies of memos that mirrored the language heard on the tapes. A retired construction worker in Ohio described being paid to pour concrete over sealed rooms in an old municipal building, a job he had never understood at the time, but now recognized with sickening clarity. The development corporation at the center of the Liberty Crown project issued a statement denouncing the investigation as a politically motivated witch hunt. Their legal team appeared on cable news programs, arguing that the footage was incomplete, taken out of context, that it proved nothing about present-day operations. Yet the calm certainty of their denials was undermined by the speed with which their executives began to resign, citing personal reasons or family obligations that fooled no one. Marcus's life, once defined by schedules and concrete deadlines, dissolved into a rhythm of interviews, strategy sessions, and long nights staring at a ceiling he could no longer trust to keep him safe. He moved from his apartment into a temporary location arranged by the task force, a nondescript building whose address was not listed in any public directory. He was given a phone that connected only to a handful of contacts, a precaution that felt both necessary and profoundly disorienting. The first major breakthrough came when forensic accountants traced a series of payments from a charitable foundation linked to the Development Corporation to offshore accounts opened in the late 1970s. Those accounts, dormant for decades, had recently been reactivated, moving large sums of money in a pattern that matched the timing of the Liberty Crown demolition contract. It is as if the system itself had been startled awake by the risk of exposure, scrambling to reposition its assets before the walls collapsed. Yet, even as evidence accumulated, Marcus could sense the investigation straining against an invisible barrier. There were names that never appeared on subpoenas, meetings that were postponed indefinitely, lines of inquiry that stalled without explanation. It was not that the authorities lacked information. It was that some information was apparently too dangerous to pursue. The turning point came unexpectedly through a man Marcus had never met. He was a former mid-level executive at one of the corporations now under scrutiny, someone who had retired quietly 5 years earlier with a generous severance package and a reputation for discretion. He contacted the task force through a lawyer, offering to provide testimony in exchange for immunity. His statement, when it arrived, filled 200 pages. He described a shadow committee that had operated within the corporate structure for decades, a group whose membership shifted with time but whose purpose remained unchanged. Their role was to identify threats to long-term development plans and neutralize them using methods that were never recorded in official minutes. The Liberty Crown, he said, had been only one of several locations used to gather and suppress information during the height of the urban renewal era. When the political climate changed, the rooms were sealed and forgotten, but the relationships forged there continued to shape decisions long after the tapes stopped rolling. The testimony triggered a cascade of warrants. Offices were raided, hard drives seized, accounts frozen. The map on the task force wall grew denser, its lines now overlapping in ways that made it difficult to tell where one conspiracy ended and another began. For the first time since the discovery behind the stage, Marcus felt a cautious optimism take hold. The system was bleeding. It could be hurt. That optimism was tested late one night when he was awakened by the vibration of his secure phone. The message that greeted him was brief, devoid of any identifying information. It consisted of a single sentence that referenced his daughter's school and the time she usually left for soccer practice. The implication was unmistakable. The system, wounded as it might be, was still capable of striking back. Marcus spent the next hour pacing the narrow room, his thoughts ricocheting between anger and dread. He had known this was coming. He had tried to prepare himself for it. Yet knowing was not the same as enduring, and the realization that his choices now endangered the people he loved cut deeper than any bureaucratic reprisal ever could. By morning, he had arranged for his daughter to stay with relatives under the guise of a spontaneous family visit, adding another layer of distance between the investigation and his most vulnerable ties. It was a small measure of protection in a situation that no longer allowed for small solutions. As he left the building that day, escorted by agents who had become his constant companions, Marcus looked up at the sky, pale and unyielding. He understood now that the Liberty Crown had not merely exposed a hidden chapter of history. It had torn open a fault line that ran beneath the entire landscape of power he had grown up accepting as immutable. The system that had erased his grandfather and so many others had not died. It had evolved. And if it was to be defeated, it would require more than evidence. It would require a willingness to keep pushing even when every instinct screamed for retreat. By the time winter settled over Maple Creek, the investigation had outgrown the town that had first given it a name. What had begun behind the sealed walls of a forgotten theater now dominated headlines across the country, its reach expanding with every new disclosure. Marcus watched this transformation with a strange detachment, as though the story were no longer his own, but something that had been set in motion long before he was born and was only now reaching the point where it could no longer be contained. Snow covered the empty lot where the Liberty Crown once stood, a flat white scar at the center of the city. The fence had been taken down, the demolition halted indefinitely, leaving the site exposed to the elements and to the eyes of anyone who passed by. People stopped there often, standing at the edge of the cleared ground as if waiting for the building to rise from the earth again, not in brick and concrete but in memory. Someone left flowers at the corner of the lot, an improvised memorial to those who had vanished without names or graves. The silence that had long defined Maple Creek gave way to a chorus of voices. Town hall meetings overflowed, residents crowding into rooms that had not seen such attendance in decades. Elderly men and women who had once believed their losses were private misfortunes began to recognize fragments of their own stories in the names and faces now circulating online. A woman in her 70s described how her brother had disappeared after organizing a tenant strike in 1975. A former factory foreman spoke of being interrogated in the basement of a municipal building after refusing to falsify safety reports. Each testimony added another layer to the emerging narrative. a collective account of a period that the city had tried to forget. Marcus attended as many of these gatherings as he could, standing at the back of rooms while others spoke. He did not seek attention. His presence was already known, his face linked to the discovery that had made everything else possible. Yet he felt an obligation to listen, to bear witness to the grief and anger that had been suppressed for so long. The pattern was unmistakable. Those who challenged the redevelopment of their neighborhoods, who demanded transparency or fairness, had a way of vanishing from official records, leaving behind only families who were told to accept the inevitable and move on. The task force, now operating with federal oversight, struggled to keep pace with the flood of new information. For every document seized, 2 more were uncovered by journalists or whistleblowers who had been emboldened by the scale of the revelations. Court orders froze the assets of several major corporations, triggering panic in boardrooms that had once seemed untouchable. Lobbyists descended on Washington, arguing that the investigation threatened economic stability, that entire regions would suffer if development projects were stalled by what they called historical grievances. Marcus saw these arguments for what they were. They were the same logic that had been used to justify the destruction of his family's home, the same reasoning that had sealed rooms and buried people beneath stages and city halls. The difference now was that the justifications were being challenged in public, their assumptions laid bare in the harsh light of scrutiny. Yet the system did not collapse easily. High-profile attorneys contested every subpoena, every search warrant, dragging proceedings through a maze of appeals. Several witnesses recanted under pressure, their earlier statements dismissed as confusion or faulty memory. One former councilman who had been scheduled to testify failed to appear in court, citing medical issues that his doctors declined to specify. Rumors circulated that he had been placed in a private facility far from the reach of investigators. The strain took a visible toll on those closest to the case. The detective who had first shown Marcus the footage seemed to age months in a matter of weeks, his once precise demeanor eroded by exhaustion. Prosecutors worked through the holidays, sleeping on office couches between depositions. Even the journalists who had driven the story forward began to show signs of burnout. Their reporting now shadowed by the constant threat of legal retaliation. For Marcus, the most difficult moments came when he returned to his mother's house to check on it while she remained with relatives. The rooms were quiet in a way that felt unnatural, the furniture covered with sheets to keep off the dust. He would stand in the doorway of his grandfather's old bedroom, now a storage space for boxes that had not been opened in years, and imagine the man who had once slept there, unaware that his private defiance would one day reverberate through a nation. It was in these moments that the abstract notion of justice became intensely personal. It was no longer about indictments or headlines, but about the simple fact that a life cut short had not been forgotten. The breakthrough that finally shifted the balance came in the form of a single ledger, discovered in a safety deposit box registered under a false name. Its pages documented payments to individuals whose roles had previously been impossible to prove. Judges, police chiefs, zoning board members, each listed alongside dates and sums that corresponded with key decisions in the redevelopment of Maple Creek and similar cities. The ledger was a map of corruption written in ink, its handwriting steady and unrepentant. When news of the ledger became public, the reaction was immediate. The governor announced the formation of a special commission with powers to investigate past abuses of authority. Several high-ranking officials resigned within days, their departures framed as personal choices but widely understood as acts of self-preservation. For the first time since the Liberty Crown's demolition had been halted, Marcus allowed himself to believe that the tide might truly be turning. That belief was tested when a hearing to determine the future of the investigation was scheduled at the state capitol. The building's marble corridors echoed with the footsteps of lobbyists and reporters, its atmosphere thick with anticipation. Marcus was called to testify as one of the primary witnesses, his role in uncovering the hidden room now a matter of public record. He spoke without embellishment, recounting the day the wall fell and the images that had followed. He described the photograph that had connected the footage to his grandfather, the envelope left on his windshield, the calls that had traced his family's routines. He did not dramatize his fear, trusting the facts to speak for themselves. As he looked out over the room, he saw faces hardened by years of political maneuvering and others softened by genuine shock. He could not tell which were which, only that the distinction no longer mattered. The story was out. It belonged to everyone now. The commission recessed late in the evening, its members retreating to deliberate behind closed doors. Outside, snow fell in thick, slow flakes, muting the sounds of the city. Marcus stood on the steps of the Capitol, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, and waited. He thought of the empty lot in Maple Creek, of the flowers that had begun to wilt beneath the weight of winter, and wondered how many more seasons would pass before the ground there would be allowed to speak again. When the decision was finally announced, it came not with fanfare but with a brief statement released to the press. The investigation would continue with expanded authority. A permanent task force would be established to examine similar sites across the state. Funds would be allocated for the identification of victims and the creation of a public archive to preserve the evidence that had been so nearly erased. The words were formal, restrained, yet they carried a force that Marcus felt in his chest like a physical blow. The city had broken its silence. The system had been forced, at least for the moment, to acknowledge the lives it had consumed in the name of progress. As he turned away from the Capitol and headed back toward the hotel where he was staying under an assumed name, Marcus knew that the struggle was far from over, but he also knew that something irreversible had begun, a shift in the story that no amount of money or influence could fully undo. Spring arrived in Maple Creek without ceremony, as if the town itself were uncertain whether it deserved renewal. The snow receded from the empty lot where the Liberty Crown had once stood, revealing patches of muddy earth and fragments of concrete that no cleanup crew had yet bothered to remove. For months, the investigation had consumed every waking hour of Marcus's life, stretching his nerves thin and pushing his endurance to limits he had not known existed. Now, with indictments filed and a permanent commission established, he found himself standing in the middle of a silence that felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous in its calm. The city did not return to normal so much as it learned how to exist in a different way. Construction projects that had once seemed inevitable were suspended pending review, their skeletal frameworks looming over neighborhoods like reminders of promises deferred. In their place came public hearings, forums, archival exhibits that filled the old municipal building with photographs and transcripts pulled from the sealed rooms beneath theaters and offices. The past, which had once been buried under layers of official language, was now displayed behind glass for anyone willing to look. Marcus attended the opening of the first of these exhibits without telling anyone he would be there. He arrived early, before the crowd, wandering through rooms that had been converted into makeshift galleries. The faces stared back at him from the walls, men and women whose lives had intersected briefly with the Liberty Crown and then disappeared into the machinery of redevelopment. Some were young, their expressions caught in moments of defiance or hope. Others were middle-aged, already worn down by battles they could not win. He recognized none of them personally, yet he felt a kinship that was almost painful in its intimacy. A photograph of his grandfather occupied a corner of the final room. It had been enlarged from the still frame Marcus had first seen, its graininess smoothed by digital enhancement. The man in the image looked directly at the camera, his expression neither fearful nor resolute but intensely focused, as though he had been aware that he was preserving something more important than himself. Marcus stood there for a long time, until the murmur of voices outside grew loud enough to remind him that he was no longer alone in carrying this story. Life, in its stubborn persistence, began to intrude on the spaces that had once been filled entirely by investigation. His mother returned home in early April, her relief at seeing familiar walls tempered by the knowledge that those walls were no longer the safe refuge she had once believed them to be. They spoke cautiously at first, skirting the events of the past year, then gradually allowing themselves to acknowledge what had been lost and what had been found. She confessed that she had spent most nights replaying her own memories of her father, trying to reconcile the quiet man she had known with the figure now celebrated as a whistleblower long before the term existed. Marcus's professional life resumed in a tentative form. His certification was reinstated after a review that quietly dismissed the allegations against him, yet he found that returning to demolition work was no longer simple. Each site he visited carried with it the unspoken question of what lay hidden beneath its surfaces. He began to refuse contracts that involved tearing down historical buildings without a thorough survey, a stance that earned him a reputation as difficult, but also drew the attention of preservation groups who saw in him a potential ally. The most unexpected change came in the form of an invitation from the commission overseeing the investigation. They asked Marcus to serve as a consultant on a pilot program designed to audit redevelopment projects in towns with histories similar to Maple Creek's. The work would involve travel, interviews, a role that was neither fully official nor entirely symbolic. He accepted with a mixture of apprehension and determination, aware that this path would keep him tethered to the very system he had spent months dismantling. His first assignment took him to a small city 2 states away, a place whose abandoned opera house bore an unsettling resemblance to the Liberty Crown. As he walked through its dusty corridors with a local inspector, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sense that he was stepping onto ground that did not want to be disturbed. Yet, this time he was not alone. The presence of the commission, the knowledge that the investigation was now institutionalized rather than improvised, lent a measure of protection that he had lacked before. In the evenings he called his daughter, who had returned to her school and soccer practice with a resilience that both comforted and bewildered him. She asked when he would come to one of her games, and he promised that he would, meaning it with a sincerity that surprised him. For so long he had lived in the margins of his own life, measuring time in deadlines and construction phases. Now he found himself learning how to plan for moments that did not revolve around crisis. The empty lot in Maple Creek became the subject of heated debate. Some residents wanted the Liberty Crown rebuilt as a theater, a symbol of cultural revival that would reclaim the space from its dark history. Others argued for a memorial park, a place of quiet reflection rather than entertainment. The commission announced a public design competition, its guidelines emphasizing transparency and community involvement. Marcus attended the first planning meeting and watched as people who had once avoided civic engagement leaned forward in their chairs, eager to shape a future that would no longer be imposed on them. On a warm evening in late May, he walked the perimeter of the lot, the grass already pushing through the cracks in the concrete. Children rode their bikes along the temporary fence, laughing in a way that felt almost defiant, given what the ground beneath them had concealed. Marcus paused at the spot where the hidden room had been, its exact location now marked by a simple plaque installed by the city. He touched the metal with his fingertips, feeling the coolness of it against his skin, and allowed himself to grieve in a way he had not done since the beginning. The system that had orchestrated so much harm had not vanished. Trials would drag on for years, appeals would wind their way through courts, and many of those responsible would never face consequences commensurate with their actions. Yet, the silence that had once protected them was gone. In its place stood a record that could not be sealed away again, a network of people who knew how to look beneath the surfaces they were offered. Marcus returned home that night to find his mother sitting on the porch, watching the light fade from the sky. They spoke about ordinary things at first, the weather, the new grocery store opening on Main Street, then gradually drifted back to memories of his grandfather. She told him about a habit he had of writing notes to himself on scraps of paper, reminders about small tasks that he insisted were the secret to accomplishing larger ones. Marcus smiled at the thought, recognizing in it a reflection of his own tendency to break overwhelming problems into manageable pieces. When he went inside, he retrieved the still frame from the hidden room, which he had kept tucked into a book since the exhibit had opened. He placed it on the table beside a new photograph taken at his daughter's last game, the two images forming a quiet bridge between past and present. It was not closure in any complete sense. The losses were too great, the damage too deep for that. But it was a beginning, a way of acknowledging that the long way back from buried truths was not measured in demolitions or indictments alone, but in the daily work of refusing to forget. Outside, the town settled into the rhythms of another evening. Lights flickered on in the houses that had once been slated for removal, and somewhere down the block someone began to play music through an open window. Marcus listened, letting the sound wash over him, and understood that the story of Maple Creek, like his own, would continue to unfold long after the headlines faded. The ground had spoken. Now it was up to those who remained to decide what they would build upon it. If this story stayed with you, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss what comes next. New investigations, new hidden truths, and new stories are already on the way. Share this video with someone who loves real mysteries and let more people discover what was buried for decades.